everybody, how we doing today? Beautiful day here in the Florida Keys. We're just driving along here on US 1 on the 7-mile bridge, heading over to the direction of Key West. So we've got the Atlantic Ocean to my left, and that's the Gulf of Mexico on my right. Now that's a great lead-in for today's video, which is going to be about where in the Keys is the best fishing. Now, I get that question all the time, and a lot of it has to do with people not realizing that the Keys is not just a little section or just one little island. The Keys are actually a stretch of islands that extends out about 110 miles out into the middle of the ocean, somewhat southwest of the mainland of Florida. And there's the US 1, which is the main artery that connects you through with a bunch of different bridges all the way to Key West. Another big somewhat misconception is the types of fish and the abilities to fish for certain species when you're in the Keys. Because of that the Keys are all the same. A lot of times people think, oh, I could just go to Key West, or I could go to Marathon, or I can be in Key Largo, and I'm in the thick of things for marlin, then catch a tuna, then catch some yellowtails, and then catch a tarpon, and then a redfish, and then a bonefish, all right outside my door, because that's where I'm at. And that's gonna kind of help today with just kind of understanding that there's quite a bit of changes in the ecosystems, because again, like I said, we're talking about a 110-mile stretch leading out into the middle of the ocean. So that's another thing that this video is going to help with. All right, so we're back and we're talking about where in the Florida Keys is the best fishing. All right. Now, some people that are familiar with the Keys might be like, what, are you crazy? The Florida Keys are great. And then you have another group that have actually never been to the Keys. They only know what they see on the fishing shows and whatnot. And they're like, oh, the Florida Keys, I mean, you just step out on your balcony and you've got tarpon and sailfish and marlins and tunas and bonefish just like right there, right? And that's kind of what this video is going to be about, is to kind of help people understand that the Florida Keys are made up of a bunch of different islands, one after another. There's one single road that connects them, bunch of bridges, and that it's basically from the mainland and then going right out northwest 110 miles. Okay, so it's very expansive. It's same but different. All right, is a good way to look at it. And it's a very unique ecosystem itself, but there's also very big ecosystems around it that are variable. So today's video, we're going to kind of go through and kind of take a look at that. Who's going to help? Probably if you're planning a trip to come down here as a tourist, you're looking to move down here, okay? It's good to realize that when you're picking a place to choose, especially if you're looking to come down here because of the fishing, is that you can get a spot real easy because there's one available here, but it's 20, 50, 100 miles from the actual zone where those fish that you're targeting are known for. And it would be kind of a mistake for you to kind of pick this spot, not knowing that you could have got a spot over here, and anytime you opened up your patio and walked out, you're in like the primo spot in the world to catch that certain fish. It's kind of that important. Also, for those people that are living down here and have lived down here, living here now, a lot of times people, where they live is where they fish, and they don't kind of get outside the box very often. And this will help them to know that, hey, maybe you don't realize that 20 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles down the road is a total different ecosystem with even better fishing, new types of way of catching that species that you enjoy, and so on. So that's what today's video is kind of going to be about. Now, since we are looking at like I said, 110-mile stretch from Key West to Key Largo, it'd be very difficult for me to just say, boom, that's the spot right there, GPS coordinates, dot, 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 dot. That's the best spot, all right? So I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use the top spot fishing maps. I sell these in the All About the Bait store. I've got them for a lot of South Florida, but also for the Keys. Got the lower Keys, middle Keys, upper Keys, and then the South Florida offshore. So that's kind of a natural break, and I think that'll kind of make things a little bit more convenient. In the Keys, that's kind of how people break it down, the lower, middle, and upper. So I think we'll stick with that. Lower wise, it basically runs from Key West, Boca Chica, going towards the west, all the way out past the Marquesas to the area about halfway to the Dry Tortugas. So that's considered the lower. Then you go to the east from there, Key West to there, all the way out to Long Key, including like the Big Pine, Marathon where I'm at, out to Long Key. That's considered like the middle Keys. And then from east of the Long Key to Key Largo, and then even north to the Fleming Key in Florida Bay, that's kind of considered the upper Keys. Now it also allowed me to kind of use US 1 as a dividing point, since it's a natural barrier between the Gulf of Mexico to the north and the Atlantic to the south. So that's kind of how I'm going to break out the areas there. Alright, so let's talk about the factors we're going to use to find that hot spot here in the Florida Keys. Now, this section of the video is actually probably the most important. It's probably going to be the most useful in that, although I'm going to apply it to the Florida Keys, you can also apply it to pretty much any fishing spot and it'll be extremely helpful. Okay, so let's start off with the first factor, and this is a factor that we're not going to use, and that's the old fishing report. All right, so Jane Doe came down to the Florida Keys, fished a certain area and caught a ton of fish, just slayed them. So that's got to be the best fishing spot in the Florida Keys. Well, I would come back, well, did you have other representation of somebody else fishing that same current, same time of day, using the same bait, using the same technique, a mile away, 5 miles, 50 miles away, to be able to compare it to see if it actually is better than one or the other? Well, no. Alright, so that's the reason why it's really not comparative to use someone individually catching something and then, oh, that's the best spot. Okay, and that kind of leads into the second area as well, which is the factor that there's an old saying, there are no fences. Alright, and when it comes to fishing, what that means is that in that open water, in that ocean, there's no fences that limit where a fish can go. If there's water, a fish can go there. So if Nemo is in the Gulf of Mexico hanging out there but wants to go to visit family in the Atlantic, all he's got to do is just swim under the US 1 bridge, come out, boom, he's in the Atlantic Ocean. That's all there is. There's no fences that say that fish are going to be in just this one pocket area. So we have to know there's not that limitation. So what other parameters I'm going to actually use? And there's only 3 of them. They're very basic, and they're exactly what I use when I'm out on my prospecting trips, micro fishing for a specific little area, looking for those the fish. Okay, but there's one that's even actually more important, and I always like to emphasize it because it encompasses everything, and that is wind / the weather / Mother Nature controls everything. I can give you the exact GPS coordinates, the time, date, what bait to use, what rigs to use, everything. If Mother Nature says 25 knot winds, it doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to fish it and utilize it. It's just not going to be a factor in it. The wind controls everything, and I just keep having to repeat that because it is the only thing that matters realistically. What the wind will allow you to do. Why that's important, so you don't just rely on that one GPS spot, that you've got a spot when it's running 20 knots out of the east, when it's running 15 knots out of the north, when it's running 10 knots out of the west, when it's 5 and under. These are all the spots that I've got planned out that I can go and fish, and then you're going to be much better off. Okay, So that's kind of an overview. Now the three factors that I use are very basic but very important. One is current. Okay, current is probably the most universal, covers every species, and that current is food. Okay, current is like a food delivery service for fish. Fish are very smart and they've evolved and they're knowledgeable enough to know that they can't expend more energy chasing food than that food value of that target fish is. Okay, so they can't go out sprinting, jumping, running full speed to catch a little glass minnow, knowing that they burned more energy to catch that than it was a value, because they would basically starve and die. All right, so fish are smart. Majority of the fish are going to do the laziest as they can, hang out, wait for that current, comes over, brings that food up, they go up, ambush it, eat it, get back down wherever they can to be just nice and calm, and they've got energy more than what they used, and that's the name of the game, survival. All right, super important, whether it be in the channels, in the backcountry, on the reef, even in the pelagic, same thing. They don't want to be just swimming against the current as hard as possible, trying to catch up with stuff. They want to find a pocket that they can just glide in, use minimal energy, and then wait for those bait foods to show up and then go up and grab them the same way. So pretty much all the fish are universal in that regard. Second almost works in conjunction with the current, and that is structure. Structure gets fish out of the current so they're saving energy, and it creates an ambush point so they can just jart up, grab that bait, fish, go back down again, and reduce the amount of energy. Plus it allows them to get closer because they're hidden. Okay, so structure is very important. And then it evolves even more because those smaller fish are attracted to that structure because it's safety. It's safety to stay away from those predators. They can get in the cracks and crevices underneath it, swim around it, and get chased around, and rather than being out in that open water. It's also good, structure is also important for reproduction. So those small fry, once they're birthed, okay, they're tiny and they're easily gobbled up. So they have those little crevices that they can hide under, the mangrove roots, those pockets in the mangrove islands where they can get out and just basically hide in that structure and feed, because there's food there as well, get bigger to the point where they're over there using that structure as an ambush point rather than a hiding spot. Okay, so structure is very key as the number two. The number three is migration patterns. Knowing the migration patterns in the Keys is huge because not all of our fish are here year-round. There's a few, but majority of the fish migrate in and then they migrate out. So it's much easier to catch a fish when they're there than when they're not there. Okay, ding, ding, ding. All right. So for example, our big tarpon migration, the big 100-pounders, they're up in the Gulf of Mexico. They're up on the Atlantic side, two big groups. Then around end of February, March, April, and then ending in Mayish, okay, they come down to the Keys for the reason of reproduction. Okay, the Keys provide food and a place to relax. They're not actually reproducing right there in the Keys here. They're going out to the deep water where they do the actual reproduction. And that takes up a lot of energy getting out there. It takes up a lot of energy to reproduce there. And then it takes a lot of energy to get back. So they're gorging on food when they get down to the Keys. Then they take off, they come back, they gorge on that food. All they do is rest and eat. Okay, and that's perfect for fishermen. Okay, there's massive schools of them all over the place. They're eating, which is the second challenge, and we're catching. Okay, so if you want to look like a pro, look like what you know what you're doing, even though you don't know what you're doing, come in March, April, May. When they're here, they're eating, and you're golden. When you don't want to come is December, end of November, December, January, where it's cold. We're getting those cold fronts. Tarpon don't like the cold. They're not going to be here for the migration, and the ones that stick around are going to be out in the deep water, staying away from that cold weather, and you're just not going to catch anything. Okay, so you know when the fish are here, that's just as important. Same thing with bait migrations as well. Bait comes, predator fish follow. All right, so super important. And those are the three key things that I utilize to prospect, to find my fishing hotspots. And we're going to apply the same thing here. Now, my personal history, I've been fortunate enough to have been able to live in and fish in each one of these zones. I originally started in Key West, and there I matched up with a local charter captain who also did commercial fishing on the side. So I learned all the basics, just kind of doing some mate work, boat prep, maintenance, upkeep, as well as all the line rigging, fishing rod rigging, that kind of stuff. And definitely the bait part. That's where the All About the Bait came from, was my time there and learning about how important it was. It was primarily light tackle, a lot of reef fishing, a little bit of offshore trolling, a little bit of wreck jigging. We used bucktails, not like the vertical jigs I use now. But I would say about 80% of the fishing he did for customers was based around pilchards. It was just such a massive deal. Learned all the aspects of finding and catching and maintenance of keeping them. Had a full bay at the dock, just strictly for his big bait tanks there, as well as blue runners were another big live bait thing. Since I didn't have a boat and I was not fishing, I also did a lot of land-based fishing. And from there I focused on the bridges, finding bait, since I knew how important bait was at that point, cast netting from shore, but also tarpon. Okay, I learned where all the tarpon spots were from that aspect. From there I actually left the country, and I was fortunate enough to visit about 50 countries and fished in about 30 different countries. And my focus of that was to learn the locals' way of fishing. So I didn't do any guides or anything like that. So I learned a lot of about hand lining, nets. I did electrolysis, shock fishing, spear fishing, dynamiting, did that as well. So I learned a bunch of these different ways that people have done fishing in Central, South America, Africa, Asia, all over the place. So that was a good experience. But then I moved back to the States. I went back to where I'm originally from, the West Coast, and there I started taking up kayak fishing. And then it was like, ding, 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 man, kayak fishing would be awesome in the Keys. So I picked up, and then I came back to the Keys, ended up in Key Largo. I had my Tarpon 140, which is my paddle kayak. I lived right on Transylvania Avenue, which is right off the Largo Sound, right by the John Penny Camp. So I fished a lot of that Largo Sound area, through the channels, out to the Atlantic side, and then the flats. And then I also paddled out and did some reef fishing out to the outside edge of the reef there. So I learned that aspect. Then on the Gulf side, I did a lot of shoreline fishing up through to Tavernier. I skipped Islamorada because just a lot of boats and a lot of people. I didn't like that, don't like it now. And then I really found my golden spot was the Indian Key Fill area there. The bridges, the channels, the flats, the islands, it was just all packed in that area. So my favorite spot up in that way there. Then from there I moved back to Key West. And then did some of the YouTube stuff started there. So that's where you see most of my videos are from. After that aspect, I targeted areas from Key West to Cujo Key was my zones that I fished. Both Gulf side and then Atlantic and then offshore. Now I am in, after a year, been here a year in Marathon. I focus specifically on the backcountry side of it. I have another video explaining why. And that was primarily Big Pine to Cujo. Gulf side, flats, backcountry, channels, islands, and then a little bit of the Atlantic side flats. And then now, just recently, I'm starting to get out to the reef and offshore. So that's kind of where I am, and where I've been fortunate enough to hit all these different aspects. Like I said, the only area that I'm really not familiar with too much is the Florida Bay and the areas between like Islamorada and Flamingo. So that's a possibility down the road. But that's kind of my history on this. So let's start getting into that, finding that spot. Okay, let's get started here. I'm over here at my work center. I'm going to do this kind of virtually because it'll give more of a macro view of the areas that I'm talking about, since we are talking about 110 miles, right? And you're basically looking at water and it doesn't really show much. But so let's get into this. All right, let's find the best spot to fish in the Florida Keys. We've got the United States here. Florida, you can kind of see the little loop-de-doo of the Florida Keys. The reason why I'm filming my monitor rather than using a screen recorder is because the screen recorders I use, OBD, doesn't allow you to capture the larger pointers. It defaults to a tiny one, so it's not very useful. So we're going to go ahead and zoom in, look at our target area here, getting down to the South Florida. Here's the Florida Keys. Basically, we're looking from Key Largo down to Key West. Now, there's a slight variation on this in that the Upper Keys, which is basically from Long Key up through Islamorada, Tavernier, Key Largo, claims the Everglades as part of the Upper Keys. So that's debatable, but we'll just kind of use that as a moderate variant. And then same thing with Key West. Lower Keys generally is Stock Island, Key West, down through the Marquesas, and then halfway out to the Tortugas, with some even including the Tortugas as part of the Lower Keys. Again, debatable, but in general, we're looking for Key West to Key Largo. Websites I'm using today, of course, is Google Maps, as you see here. I'm using the Navionics chart viewer. Their app's free on their website, and that gives a lot of information. Basically, what you would get if you had one of their Navionics cards. I'm also using this Florida Artificial Reefs Google Map type layouts, and it gives all of the major wrecks and reefs for Florida, and will help you there, especially to find specific coordinates here, and I'll give that information. And also I'll be using the NOAA website primarily to show the locations of the Gulf Stream, as well as this basic Gulf Stream chart here. So that's what we're going to be using, so let's get a move on. Alright, so let's talk about current. Now, as we're looking at a macro viewpoint, there's a couple of major impacts that we need to take a look at. The first one is actually the current or the flow or the tides in the Florida Keys. A lot of people, when they're down here, they're anchored up in one of the channels or at one of the bridges, and they're seeing all that water getting pushed past them. And then it's easy to assume that that water from the Gulf of Mexico is pushing all the way through to the Atlantic through these channels here, through all the little channels and so forth. But when in reality, if you take a step back and you take a look at this scenario here, you'll see that there's just so much volume of water. There's no possibility that all that Gulf of Mexico water is pushing through these tiny channels when you take a look at it that way. Realistically, what happens is that the water ebbs and flows east to west, and a little bit does pass through these channels north to south, but the majority of it is actually, as it rises, it'll push through this direction. As it lowers, it pushes out that way, just because the huge amount of volume there is. Now that makes a lot of difference when you're talking about the current that runs along the reef line here. It makes a difference in regards to the lower keys, and that water flow is non-impacted by anything, but you still have the flats and these little small islands around here, and that water has full flow from north to south. But then it also gets impacted quite a bit at this tip here from west to east, and that's why you'll also find is a lot of these islands in the lower keys have a lot more cuts next to them and are deeper than you do and you find in these middle and upper keys, because there's more impactful water flow down here. So that's kind of something to look at there. Another thing to look at is up here towards the upper keys. when it comes to that current flow. If you ever really take a look from the mainland and you follow the US 1, you'll find that there's actually not very much in regards to water passage between the Gulf side and the Atlantic side. There's a couple little creeks through here on the US 1, then as you make the turn, there's one little boating channel from in Key Largo. There's a few little cuts along through Tavernier, and then the only main opening start once you get to Islamorada, and that's where you're going to start seeing the bigger bridges, the bigger openings all through the middle keys here, okay, and then they lessen as you get to the lower keys. But that is kind of important when we talk about even this upper section here, how it impacts this Florida Bay, the Everglades. Through Islamorada here, you get a lot of water passage from the Gulf, that water there. But as you start moving in, you start getting more stagnant water where the water just rises up and down. It doesn't actually flow across between the two. So you're not pushing a lot of bait back and forth in these areas here. So that's going to affect our inshore fishing. The next major flow that we're going to take a look at is, bam, right here, and that's the Gulf Stream. So this black part here, this leg sticking through here, is the mainland Florida. You'll see this section here, there's some dots, that's the Florida Keys, and this spaghetti line here is actually the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is basically the river within the ocean. Pushes tons of current. It actually has different temperatures than the rest of the ocean because the water it pushes through here moves faster than the other water, so it affects it in that way as well. It's such of an importance if you ever use the NOAA's website, where you get the actual wind and wave heights, because they've got those markers out there with the gauges on them. You'll see on their charts is that the first thing they actually give you is the edge of the Gulf Stream compared to those buoys out there. So as you'll see down in the lower keys off of Key West, you got the Sand Key Light, basically 7 miles off of Key West at the edge of the reef. It's 41 miles to the Gulf Stream. Then the middle keys here, for example, Marathon, the Sombrero Key Light, it's 41 miles as well. But then if you look down here at Key Largo and the Molasses Reef Light, it's only 10 miles. So that Gulf Stream does angle quite a bit closer to that Key Largo, and very close as you get up to like Fort Lauderdale on the mainland there. So as we're talking about the Gulf Stream, that equates to species-wise the pelagics. We're talking the wahoo, kingfish, mahis, tunas, sailfish, marlin, great white sharks, the ones that follow that and basically use that Gulf Stream as their highway, as well as a food source, as they're constantly out in the blue waters rather than sitting on the reef. So that's very effective there. If you're a blue water fisherman, you don't want to go far. Key Largo it's only 10 miles out to the Gulf Stream. If you're in the Key West, Middle Keys, it's a 40-mile drive. However, I'm going to say also, though, that season-wise, that changes. During the winter time, that Gulf Stream will push in where it's running parallel with the reef. So it is quite affected by the seasons. But there you go. That's kind of something we're going to kind of factor in, is that current and those locations of those current sources and how it relates to our fishing and our finding that hot spot. Next, structure. So let's take a look at structure. Now remember, we're talking about macro, 120 miles, Key West to Key Largo. So although structure is a rock, a tree, a mangrove island, a bridge, a wreck, a channel, okay, a ledge, all right? But we can't just isolate just one tiny spot there. So we're gonna look at a macro view, and I'm gonna break it down to different areas. So let's talk about the offshore blue water structure. Now, definitely one of the favorites and probably the most important are in the middle keys, and that is the humps. So you've got all the Islamorada humps here. There's the 409 humps. There's the Marathon humps. There's basically what these are pinnacles out in the deep water. So you've got 1,000-foot depths, and then you have these risers, these pinnacles that rise up 500 feet from the floor bottom. And with them being out in that Gulf Stream area, those heavier current areas, you get these major upswells. Okay, and that upswells creates agitation, and that structure attracts the bait, which attracts the food that eats that bait, which attracts the fish that eats that bait. Okay, and it just becomes a magnet. All these little icons here, the humps. All right, and they're probably the most famous offshore structure around. Key West has the wall, the Woods Wall, which is just south of Key West. Yeah, right along this edge here. So you're looking at 1,000, drops off to 2,000 right along the edge. And that's, again, another upswelling cause there, even though it's in very deep water. But it's an attractant. It's something out in the middle of this desert of nowhere. And that's where you're going to find a lot of pelagics, and you're going to find a lot of the blue water guys from the lower keys heading to offshore. Like I said, that was my first solo trip on a boat. Was there, but I would say the humps here are probably the major draw for any offshore blue water area, right along here, and then with the Gulf Stream running along the whole edge there being a second. Next, we can move in a bit. Let's go directly towards the bridges. Okay, so that's a dividing line between the Gulf Atlantic. As I mentioned earlier, the upper keys, there's not very much passageway, so there's not really much in the way of bridges here. It doesn't start until you start hitting Islamorada. You have probably the best stretch of bridges going from Big Pine to Islamorada because you have nothing. And the reason why it's better is because when you have nothing anywhere, any structure becomes a bigger magnet, and these bridges are a magnet because there is literally nothing out here around these sections. Marathon. Okay, so fish are going to go where their structure, so they're going to go to these bridges here. Then as you go to the Big Pine to Big Coppet area here, I think it's less of an impact in regards to the bridges because look at all the structure of these islands. So what does these bridges have that these islands don't? They don't have anything. There's no difference. So they don't have as much food along these edges, the flats and stuff. So they're not as much of a magnet there. As you get to the lower keys, there's again not many passageways. They tend to be thinner water compared to the bridges in the middle keys here. So not that much of an impact. However, there's not much else around here, so they do have a moderate impact. And then no bridges out from there. Next, we can take a look at the landmass as structure. Okay, very important here. And as you look across here, as you see, nothingness around my marathon. All right, but you got this area, that Big Pine to Big Coppet, Sugarloaf, and look at that land masses. There you've got the fingers, okay, that run from US 1 all the way out 3, 4, 5 miles out into the Gulf, stretching out here, and you've got these channels running alongside them, and the flats between them, and the cuts through them, and all those grassy areas around these islands. You've got all the mangroves where the fish can hide. I mean, it's the smorgasbord there. Only thing probably better comparative, if you include it, would be the Everglades. Okay, that's probably the breadbasket of all the inshore fisheries, comes from there. But then again, it depends on where you're going to count the upper keys. I considered slightly that these islands here are part of the upper keys versus calling it the Everglades where it should be. But this here, second to that Everglades, is kind of like a nursery zone. And then it's quite a bit different as you get down to the lower keys. It becomes a lot less sparse in regards to the islands. You still have quite a bit of flats. You have some very distinct cuts. And we'll see the pluses and minuses between those. And then you also have the structure here, different type. It's more flats. There's a few scattered islands, and then you have these uprising connections that run through there with these smaller cuts that allow you to passage between these high rise, which are exposed during the low tides. So those are the different kinds of structures that we're looking at there. Wrecks, I'm going to have to say there's a lot of wrecks throughout the Keys. Most are somewhat in shallow, and most are infested with divers because they are shallow. I will say that the lower Keys has the better wrecks for like the vertical jigging. So you've got wrecks in the 320, 420, 350, 250. You've got the tugboat, the helicopter. You've got all these wrecks out in the Gulf, and that's mainly due to Key West being a harbor port, a major port throughout the years, throughout the century. So that's why you're going to have more wrecks out in this area. A lot more of the man-made wrecks or the rubble piles along the middle Keys because of the bridges, but like again, they're more shallow water spots. And then same, you have the man-made shipwrecks in more shallow water because they're mainly made for divers. You've got the famous ones up here by Key Largo, the Jesus statue, Vandenberg in Key West. But fishing wise, deeper water, I'm going to say lower Keys probably has more variety, more fishable wrecks than the rest of the Keys there. All right, so that is structure. Next up, we've got the migration. Now, in regards to the Florida Keys, I live by a few different quotes. Of course, number one is, it's all about the bait. All right, that one's so important, I started a company based on that one. Well, the second one is, well, actually, the second one I already know is the wind controls everything. So you hear me say that a lot. Well, I've got a new one. That's the third one. And that is, it's easier to catch a fish when it's there than when it's not. All right, ponder that a moment. We're getting deep. But that has something to do specifically with migrations. So for example, in the Florida Keys, I would say 60 to 70% of our sports fish are somewhat related to a migration pattern. So let's talk about one in particular, the tarpon, the Silver King. Now that fish generates millions of dollars for the Florida Keys. People fly from all around the world just to try to catch one. They have actually a pattern where summertime, you actually have them hanging out up here in this East Coast in this cooler weather, cooler water temps. They're up in these tributaries, up in these cuts, hanging out, doing their thing. There's actually two different gangs. You've got the Atlantic gang, and then you've got the Gulf of Mexico, two separate tribes. The Gulf side they call kind of greenbacks. They tend to be the first ones to show up because I think they're warm weather creatures more than the Atlantic side ones. But anyways, as we start getting closer to winter time and that freezing temp starts moving down the coastline here, those water temps start dropping. Now tarpon like that 72, 73 degree temp as their trigger. So once those water temps start hitting that, they start looking for warmer water and try to keep looking for that. So as that cooler water temp starts coming down from the winter time, that pushes those tarpon down to the coast here. So that's why you start looking about that February time frame. That cooler weather, cooler water temps start hitting up here, and those Gulf side ones are the first ones to kind of make it down to the Keys. Then the Atlantic ones shortly follow up. They start meeting up here in big numbers, March, April, May time frame. They get their food on, then they start coming out to the deep 2,000 plus waters, do their spawning, swim all the way back, get to the Keys, feed up again, rest, and then by that time, summertime heat kicks in. That water temp is up in the high 80s, close to 90. They don't like that, so they start triggering their way and moving back up to their northeastern corridors there, and a cycle starts all over again. So that's kind of a way the tarpon functions, and a good example of how that works. For the inshore guys, we've got something similar, the redfish. Okay, I think you find redfish, I don't know, up to Maine maybe. I mean, they're all up the East Coast and all along the Gulf Coast. But they're another one very sensitive to the temperatures. So as that cold weather starts pushing down, that pushes them down to the farthest south that they can go, and to the point where they generally, the big schools, the main drove of them tends to end up here in the South Florida, primarily because of the Everglades. You have a lot of water area here. You've got a lot of food. It's kind of the food basket, a lot of channels. You've got a lot of food on the Atlantic side, so they really take up residence there. And then you've got the other ones that still want to push on a little bit farther, a little bit more Caribbean atmosphere, so they'll work their way down to the Keys. Some of them reach the Big Pine area, and they're like, whoa, hey, we found the Everglades 2, the Big Pine Riviera here. So it's very similar conditions as the Everglades. They'll lie up here. And then when I was living in Key West, about 2 weeks out of the year, we'll get those really harsh 50, 60 degree water temp, not air temps, when a north front would push due for a couple days. And then I could go out and in this area here, and I had a couple of redfish spots, and I would catch redfish for a couple of weeks, and then they would disappear and I would never see them again. Which was a major reason why I actually moved to Marathon, is that I wanted that ability to catch redfish whenever I wanted to and however I wanted to, and have more options like that. So that's why I'm here now. But that's kind of the deal on the redfish. Offshore guys, the blue water guys, sailfish. Another one, temperature related. Those guys, sailfish, are well known all the way up here in the East Coast. Summertime, want that cooler water. They're out here not along the reef edge of the shoreline, but they're out in the blue water, following the edge of the Gulf. Looking at all these cliff sides here and just kind of hanging out. They actually spawn whenever they want to, but as that colder freezing temperatures start moving in the northeast, they start shifting down and following that edge of the Gulf, where they can stay warm and find this warmer water down here along the Florida coastline, the Bahamas, and down to the Keys. They actually also follow a migration of bait, their food source, which is the ballyhoo, and that's why during certain times during the winter time is that those sailfish will be doing what they call sprays, where they will come right along to the edge of the reef where the ballyhoo schools are and chase those ballyhoo up, and that gives you a chance to actually sight fish for sailfish as they're chasing those ballyhoo. And then again, they'll hang around, and then they'll move off as the time comes around. Inshore, there's actually some other types of more mini migrations, I would call them. And for example, down in the lower Keys, we have the spawn periods for the mutton snappers. So there's a few key spots around the edge of the reef here along the reef line where the mutton snappers spawn every year in the summertime. They just meet in these certain little spots and do their thing, and it's such an important aspect that there's actually laws now where you can't fish those areas during this certain spawn time. Then otherwise, there's other snappers, the mangroves, yellowtail snappers. They actually, during the middle summertime, full moons, will navigate their way out to the reef, 20 to 40 foot range, and do their spawns out here as well. Then after summer, then they start moving back to spread out all over the place. For you flats guys, there's actually another type of minis type of migration, and that's strictly weather. So for example, the bonefish, summertime, as you saw there, big time for the bonefish. They're on these flats feeding up quite a bit. But then as that cooler weather ends and we get those cold fronts that shock the water for a couple days, drops them into the 70s. Sometimes they'll get down to low, high or mid 60s. You'll see those bonefish will disappear. They'll take off to deep water where it's a little bit more cold, controlled temperatures. But after a couple days, after those storm fronts leave, then the temps kick up again and the water temps kick up, and then they migrate back to the flats, and then your flats guys are back on them again. So that's another example of kind of a migration that goes in effect. Now, for those that are planning a trip and they're not familiar with the migration, here's an excellent tool that I've used ever since I've lived down here since the beginning. This is the Dreamcatcher Charters, very popular, based out of Key West, and they've got this Key West fishing seasons link there. And like I said, I used it back actually when they just started up that conglomerate, the Guide Mafia with Steve Lamp leaving it. Basically what it is that usually guides are individual companies. They do everything from start to finish themselves. Well, back in the late 90s when I lived here, he had just started up this kind of umbrella company where he gave the opportunity where his company would take care of everything, all the administration stuff, marketing, reservations, take care of the boats, the maintenance and everything. So basically all the guides had to do was show up at the dock. The customers would be waiting for them. They take them out fishing, bring the customers back, drop them off, and then they can go home. And Steve Lamp's company would take care of everything else. And that took off really well. But that company, but he also developed this chart, and so I thought it was always well thought out. It's very organized. It's broken down by month, so you got each month has a category, and then within that month there's the category by fishing style. So you got flats fishing, backcountry, wrecks, blue water fishing, and then a very detailed information on the types of fish that are going to be the prime suspects, and then kind of like a general fishing report, what to expect. So for example, if we take a look at October, where we're in here now, flats fishing, permit, bonefish, tarpon, baby tarpon. September and October are without the doubt the best in flats fishing. Okay, and that's kind of also has to do with, like I mentioned, September, October weather is probably what I figure the best flats, calm weather and longer extended time frames than any other months there. And then you still have that cooling effect in October, and that's why that flats fishing is really good. Backcountry stuff, all the different species. Tarpon slows up but not done. And he's talking about the migration. There's still some tarpon hanging around, the big ones, because we're still warm weather and some still like it. But the full migration, that's been over. Like I said, that ends about May, June time frame, and the bulk of the big guys are gone. And then the wrecks, reef, blue water stuff, dolphin, marlin, wahoo, swordfish, deep dropping. And that's the usual menu for the offshore during the summertime, is specifically like the dolphin. They move in and there's big numbers. Still a strong month for dolphin. Fish keep getting smaller and a bit less numerous, meaning that's coming towards the end of the peak mahi season. But then I also like to look here, like for me, kudas starting off in November is prime. Barracudas December, January, barracudas, February. That's that cold winter months. The limits on the prime sports fish, but the kudas are always there for a fight. And why that's important, because I actually started a company just based on that. And this is www.kudatube.com, my new website that just started out with here. You can check that out as a sneak peek. But yeah, huge important topic for me there. But that's a kind of a way, especially if you're planning a trip to come down to the Keys, very important that if you're specifically coming here for a certain target species, that you identify that you're going to be here the same time that they're there. Otherwise, like the saying goes, it's easier to catch a fish when they're here than when they're not. So anyways, that is migrations. All right, so let's start with the category of the flats, and we're looking at the Grand Slam species. They're permit bonefish tarpon. I'm throwing in the barracuda because it's kind of a specialty deal down here during the winter time. When these guys take off because of a cold front, the barracudas are fine with it, and they are always ready for a fight. So let's take a look at these species here on our map. One thing to remember, there are no fences in this ocean here, so a lot of these, or pretty much all of these species, you're going to find all across lower, mid, upper, but we're going to try to funnel it down and target certain areas being better than the others. So starting with permit, I'm going to stick with the historical choice, which is the Lower Keys, Key West area. That is for two reasons. One is structure. Around Key West, we probably have more wrecks than anywhere else. And also little reef and pinnacles and rock piles all around the Gulf side and Atlantic side. The reason being is when permit are spawning, they go out to the open water and they hang around those pinnacle areas, relief areas, and they just hang out there in droves and just swim around in circles, do their spotting stuff, and then hang around there throughout most of the year actually, and then with some of them breaking off and coming back to the actual keys here. Second reason why is, again, internally, the inshore part of it in regards to structure is the ability to find them and catch them. They're very difficult fish. They're probably one of the hardest fish to catch. Got those big eyes, very spooky, and especially if you're talking fly. So the reason why I'm picking a lower, although look at Big Pine, talking about structure, they've got it in tenfolds more than anywhere else. Beautiful channels. Look at these finger islands and going on the keys all the way up to the outside edge of the Gulf, just packed cuts going in between them, beautiful flats, beautiful turtle grass everywhere, little bays, get out of the wind, just beautiful. But how do you find fish and when there's so much to offer? It's kind of that needle in a haystack syndrome. Okay, it's too good of a structure, and a fish that are constantly on the move, it's hard to find the pattern when you have to deal with so much. Versus when you start taking that look at the lower keys, it's a lot more cut back. You have fewer islands, they're just scattered around, just a few here and there, but you still have the beautiful flat areas. Then you have the nice pristine channels. There's not tons of them. They're these nice fingers. The permit really like those because that's their highways, their escape routes, and fishing those edges are where you're going to find them. So they're manageable. You could find the fish and see them and chase after them both all along here. So for that, we're going to call the permit being the lower keys, and then I would pick second with some work would be the Big Pine to the Saddle Bunch keys, this middle keys area here. Next, bonefish. Bonefish is kind of a little bit different. Historically there, we're talking the place to be by far, world-renowned would have been Islamorada area here. Both the Atlantic side, Gulf side, they were known for not only numbers, the place to go just to catch one because of the volume they had, but also the size of them. It was not that difficult to find the double-digit bonefish in this area here, so it was definitely the place to be. However, things changed a bit. I think a key time frame was during the 2010 cold front that decimated a lot of the sports fish in the southern areas here. Usually our fish down here, especially in the wintertime, are used to it and can handle a cold front that comes through, where our normal is in the mid to low 80s. We get those cold fronts that reach down into the 60s, occasionally the 50s, lasts for a day or two, and then it rises back up to those 70s and 80s again. So those fish can deal with it, or they might run to some little bit of deeper water, and then after a day or two when it warms up, then they're right back where they were. That 2010 storm, what happened is that there was back to back cold fronts, so it never had a chance to warm up, and it just got colder and colder, so it basically eliminated any of these warm spots where these fish usually hide out, and it killed them. Okay, pretty much just wiped out the fisheries down here in the lower keys, and especially down in the Everglades, as well as all the way back up. And that really hurt, including the bonefish, so that kind of just eliminated it. Okay, not eliminated, but really cut it down a lot. And it took a long time for it to recover by just multiplying and multiplying, getting bigger and bigger. But what seemed to happen is that it didn't just spring back strictly in the Islamorada. It kind of spread itself out from all the way from the Bay, Key Largo down to the Marquesas somewhat evenly. So it was just kind of, you're seeing the smaller bonefish all over. But then as they kind of grew up, then we saw Hurricane Irma came, and that was another big change. For some reason, it really turned things up, but it really made the lower keys prosper, and the lower keys became the place to be for finding that volume of bonefish again. So a lot of guides, even in those in the middle keys, are making the drive down to the lower keys to chase after the bonefish. It's that good these days. So we're going to give the bonefish to the lower keys, and then say the Islamorada is probably still that secondary and very close. Third, we're going to be talking about the tarpon, and we're talking about the larger, the migrating one, the gangs coming from the Gulf and the gangs from the Atlantic. For this, we're going to call it the Middle Keys, and specifically why is this trench right here that allows that Gulf of Mexico group to come through between the Big Pine and Isla Mirada, all this open water bridges here. The migration area is out here in the Atlantic, so those fish have to come through. They meet up with the Atlantic group all along the Keys. And these big tarpon, they're out to the dry Tortugas, Cuba, all up and down the Keys in South Florida. So it's not like they're just here in this one spot, but there seems to be a volume of them because of those two meeting in this area here, where you're going to see a lot more than others. So we're going to give that as the primary, and the rest of it is fairly evenly bunched up. I would say the Big Pine to the Sugarloaf area here, because the structure and the food is a little better than the others, as a good secondary option. Lastly, the Barracuda, because of the specialty. Winter time, those guys leave. The Barracudas move from the offshore deeper water, specifically the big guys. Barracudas of all sizes are everywhere, 365 days a year. You're going to find them all up and down the Keys. But these upper outer edges here in these little basins, that's where those big cudas like to start hanging out around these islands. A lot of food around there, and then they're stocking up and eating and getting big. So that I'm going to give to the Middle Keys here, where the structure is, Big Pine to Sugarloaf, as key components, because they like those islands way out here in the Gulf edges there. So that's kind of the flats area here. If I had to choose one, I'm going to say the Lower Keys. The main reason for that is this area here, the Marquesas and this island patches around here, is not fished very much or as much, because it's kind of a haul to get out into these areas. There's no residential boating. There's no people really living out in these areas here. So it's quite a bit untouched. So you get more fish and you get dumber fish, because they're not pressured as much as all these places where all these islands are stacked up with people chasing after them. So that's kind of why I'm going to be picking not just the Key West proper, but all this outside area as being Lower Keys, and that's why. Alright, so that's the flats. Next up, we've got the backcountry, or the inshore. Their target species, we've got the redfish, snook, juvenile tarpon, speckled trout. I would love to say the flounder, but we do not have flounder down in the Keys, so can't add that. There is a bit of a caveat I want to kind of bring up, and it is in regards to the Upper Keys zone. If you watch a lot of the TV shows about fishing the Keys and the guys really targeting the snook and redfish and the sea trout, a lot of times what happened is they come out of Isla Mirada, all these Keys through Key Largo, and they're actually fishing up here in the Everglades. I mean, actually in the Everglades, in these channels here, or these islands right along the edge, but they consider that the Keys. All right, it's 20 to 30 miles from US 1, but they claim it as their own. So I'll leave it dependent on you. I wouldn't say it's not much different than the Marquesas being claimed by Key West. So it's just kind of how you determine it. I'm going to qualify it as they could have the edge of the mainland down to the US 1 here, but not into the actual Everglades. It still gives them a big advantage. The Everglades are the breadbasket of all the fisheries around all this area here. Most of the fish are born here, raised here, and then they migrate out from there, and then they return there, and then they spawn, and then they have their kids grow up there. An example would be, we're talking redfish, snook. I'm definitely going to say this edge up here is the #1 zone for finding the redfish and snook. They're very similar. I'd probably say they're funneling down to these islands as a second, but I would say almost a close second would be this eastern part of the Middle Keys, because it's in such close relation to the Everglades that you do get a lot of carryover down here, and then it lessens up quite a bit as you start moving down the Keys to where there's not very many in the Key West, the Lower Keys area there. but depending on how you see it, those two species are primarily mangrove structure, so these islands are very favored. They do travel in the open water, but they're really not fished that much. They're fished a little bit in wrecks, but mostly people fish for them in structure along the edges of islands and these Everglades and all these islands in between. Next up, juvenile tarpon. Here it's somewhat similar, but I'm going to say, and I think Big Pine area here and the Big Torch and this eastern side is kind of known as the juvenile tarpon capital of possibly the world. Okay, it's just phenomenal juvenile tarpon. I guess it's a very big fishery there. I find it's very excellent, so I'm going to say Middle Keys for that because I do catch them all the way through these. And tarpon are another ones that are structure oriented, especially the juveniles, but they like the bridges, they like the deep channels, and then that's what they like here. And versus like bonefish and permit, I think the juvenile tarpon outnumber them quite a bit. I could be wrong on that, but I think they are spread out a lot more, so you're going to see them on every single nook and cranny in these areas here. And then I would say the Everglades being a second to them, even though that is kind of the breadbasket where they're from. Speckled trout, same deal. It's so much so, in fact, that the Everglades, these areas here, speckled trout are a year-round fishery. I would say the Keys, getting down to the Middle Keys, especially down to the Lower Keys, it's strictly a winter fishery, strictly a winter temperature, not just the season, but it needs to have that cold front that pushes those fish off of the Everglades to know that they need to even come down a little farther. And then they'll start catching them out in the Big Pine, and then occasionally I catch them in these basins down in the lower where they're going after the food. Then we've got sharks. That's just kind of an all-around. They do come in during the winter time as well to feed like the barracudas. So I'm going to call the structure around here as a sight fishing, flats, backcountry, but the Everglades has a massive population as well. So I'm going to actually call that a tie. So that is kind of the backcountry. Where am I going to go? If I'm going to go this zone, I would say here would be my choice. But personally, I call that Everglades, so I'm going to say Middle Keys here, and specifically the eastern part of the Middle Keys. So that is the backcountry. Next category up, we've got the bridges. This one's actually fairly easy to figure out. Since the Upper Keys really doesn't have very many water passages between the Gulf and Atlantic, and the ones that they do are mainly boaters channels, not really for the fishing. This is the area that we're looking for here, basically from the west side of Isla Morada down to Big Pine. The major passageway, there's strictly nothing else there, and that's where you get those deep water channels and a lot of actual fishing bridges here. As you move down to the actual Middle Keys here, although they do have nice deep channels, they've got some nice bridges, I don't qualify them as very good fishing because of the fact that look at all the structure around them. Okay, why would you need to go to these bridges as structure when you've got all these islands and cuts and flats and everything, versus this area here where there is no backcountry, there are no islands around it, so that is the actual only structure around. And then as you get to the lower keys, there's only a very few, and they're mainly spanning flats areas, so they're not very deep. There's so much water flow through this one passageway here. I would be surprised why they don't catch tunas and sailfish through here occasionally, because I gotta imagine some of them have swum through the zones here. They catch mackerel all the time, so you're talking the Ciros, Spanish, occasional king off of these. So why would you not find a tuna or sailfish or some sort of exotic coming through and going to the Gulf or to the Atlantic? But anyways, that's the zone there for the bridges. The next category up is the reef. And when we talk the reef, we're definitely talking about the yellowtail snappers, mutton snappers, groupers, mackerels. And you can add all the other snappers as well, but that's kind of the reef species. The characteristics that we're going to use to identify the best spots are probably going to be: 1 is current, 2 is structure, and 3 is going to be fishing pressure, because the reef is kind of the thing to do in the Keys. Regardless of what type of fishing you like, the reef is kind of going to be one of those Florida Keys specific things that most everybody does. So let's take a look at the reef here. One thing I could tell you right off the bat, and this Google Maps views point here actually kind of shows realistically what I'm talking about, is you see this darker line green here, and then it starts going to that bluish purple there, which is the open water. That darker green is basically the top of the reef, and then the edge there of the actual reef. And if you look at it down here in Key West, and you look at it as you go along all the way up to Key Largo, it looks the same. And that's because that part of it is actually the same. Not too much difference between the top of the reef and then going over the edge. However, if we start taking a look at it a little bit closer, there's a little bit variance that make quite a bit of difference between the different zones. And we could best see them on the old Navionics chart. Now I'm going to go straight to the lower Keys, because that is where that difference is very prevalent. First off is the lower Keys, especially around Key West and to the west, has these sections here. You'll see this normal reef line. That's the part that's very common all the way through. But then the lower Keys has these things. See these little reef patches outside the edge of the reef? Those are called the bar. Okay, and they're basically a secondary reef. And the way it works is that you have the normal reef, and this is the same all the way across the board. It's got all the reef, comes to the edge of the reef. That's about 30 to 40 feet. And then it drops off to 70, 80, 90, 100 feet pretty quickly. And then normally it just goes out and just keeps deeper and deeper. With these bars, okay, it actually does that. It drops off to the 100 foot. Then it comes right back up. These bars are just another reef, another pinnacle, and they come back up to 40, 30, 20. I've even had them 10 feet up. Okay, and then the outer edge of the bar drops right off again, and then you're looking at going from that 30, 40 all the way back down to the 100, 120 feet there. Okay, and it's an immediate and very sharp drop off. So that's a unique magnet that the lower Keys has there, where you're going to see. I fish this outside of the bar a lot, and then I'll catch bonitos and dolphin when I'm anchored off just on the edge there, because that is basically the outside blue water stuff. During the winter time, you'll be anchored up and doing your chum on the outside edge of the bar there, and not more than 100 feet out, maybe a couple 100 feet out, will they be the big sports fishermen running kites trying to catch sailfish. So that's kind of how attractive those kind of extra structure is here. Now the second structure that's kind of more of a lower Keys things is the patch reefs. All right, and if we go in closer so we can start seeing them a little better, you see all these little edges. So all those rings are variants of by a foot. So you'll see all these round little coral heads and stuff. They're actually little peaks. And this water here is generally around 30, 40 feet, and then they rise up to the teens. Okay, and there's a lot of them all over the middle Keys here, the middle of the reef area here. So basically the way it works is you got the flats over here, then there's a drop off the flats. You have the little bit deeper, it gets to the 20, 30 feet. You have Hawks Channel, that's the boating channel. Then you start hitting the patch reefs, then you get to the main reef, and then you get to the drop-offs that I showed you earlier. But these patch reefs here are a big magnet for fish. Also, they're big fishery for the winter time when the conditions are too rough to go blue water. It's too rough to sit on the edge of the reef because you get the full impact of the water and the wind. But if you come onto the inside patch reefs here, the reef actually will knock down the current, which will knock down some of the waves, and you could fish here even in pretty rough conditions and still get that reef bite. But you can kind of see them here going in the lower Keys, and then all of a sudden they start disappearing, and that is right here when the middle Keys basically is starting. Okay, and then it's pretty much Pretty quiet, just flat ground, grass, not a lot of structure going on there. It's pretty much just a big desert, and you really don't see much until I think we get to, there's a little patch reef around Marathon, and then as you get up towards Key Largo, I think, yeah, they start coming into it a little bit. These are the ones that I used to fish when on my kayak when I lived in Key Largo, all these patch reefs, when I didn't want to come out to the reef here. So those are good areas. But that's another structure type thing that the lower Keys had that's a little different from the others. The third part the next part we're going to talk about is current. Two structures of current. One is the Gulf to the Atlantic side. The lower Keys kind of has a really nice wraparound where the water from the Gulf starts flowing out on an outgoing, and it wraps around the Keys because not everything can come through these channels here, and then all the big water from out here, and then it comes around and then it starts doing the parallel with the Keys, so you get that east to west current like I'd originally talked about before, and it pushes along here, so you get that kind of a mix of current around here that develops a different system. And again, that's another type of attractant. Now the other area where current is effect is that Gulf Stream I talked about, and there we saw where the Gulf Stream was 40 to 50 miles out from here in the Middle Keys, and it's only 10 miles out from Key Largo, and they get a big draw of current, not only that parallel current here, the east to west, but they also get that push from the Gulf Stream, so they get a big start of the current flow right here. And anytime you see those kind of current draws, you tend to find the fish start edging up in that direction in those funnels, and they start feeding more because there's more food getting pushed to them. They don't have to wait as long for that little shrimp to kind of finally make its way through here. Hits about here, then it starts getting shotgunned through there, so they know there's more food there. And then the next factor is fishing pressure. Pretty much all the way from Key Largo to Key West, it's all inhabited. There's quite a few people on all these islands here all the way through. But if we include the Marquesas, the patches, the islands through here between Key West, all the way out to halfway out to the Marquesas, I mean to the Tortugas. This area is out here, especially as you get farther west, are fished a lot less. So you get bigger fish, you get dumber fish. I would say once you start getting out in these areas here, it's more like you go out towards the west of the Marquesas, you're kind of what the Keys were 10 years ago. You go out to the Tortugas and to the west, you're kind of what the Keys was like 20 years ago in regards to just fishing out front, because of the lack of pressure, and you start seeing all these areas that are untouched, and you get a lot bigger and a lot easier to catch. So those are the kind of factors. So basically, as you can probably think, I'm going to say lower Keys for the reef action. Second would be the Key Largo because of the Gulf Stream, plus they've got the patches as well. And then this is kind of not a dead zone because we all have the reef here, and yellowtails are pretty prevalent. Outside the spawn, which is kind of a lower Keys deal, they start spreading out. Grouper, as long as you can find structure and deeper water, will attract as well. And mackerels are kind of a migrating, so it's not really going to be a factor there. So that's kind of the reefs. And our last category is offshore. We're talking the pelagics, the blue water fish, the wanderers. So we've got the sailfish, tuna, wahoo, mahi, kingfish, marlin. Now with them, they are the pelagics, like I said. That means they just continually like to swim around in the blue water. I'm going to say the Gulf Stream is a major impact on this category here as it wraps around. I would also say that southeast East Florida has an impact, especially during the migrations during the winter times when a lot of these fish are pushing down from the cold weather of the north. That the big conglomeration of them are in that southeast Florida, and then we get the slight push down, but we do get a migration when they are following the bait migration, like the ballyhoo pushing down. They'll follow those baits in, and we'll see a more of an influx of fish because of that. That sailfish is a prime example of that. I think they'll hang out primarily along the east-southeast coast of Florida. We'll get our push. We have them actually year-round in the Keys, but that bigger push will come through. They'll follow the ballyhoo, and then I'm going to have to say the upper Keys is probably going to have the upper hand. They will be kind of a somewhat attractant to the middle Keys because of the humps, and we do have a strong fishery down in the South Florida, the South Keys, so it's not too far off. Tuna is a little different. It is pelagic in that it is a wanderer, but it is also attracted to structure because of the food base there. So I'm going to say because of the location of the humps in this area here, where you've got that 1,000-foot depths, but then you have those 400 to 500-foot rises and pinnacles. Plus, you're pretty close to the Gulf Stream. Tracks a lot of bait, a lot of fish around there. So year-round, you're going to be able to find the tunas there. It's just such an impactful area there. I would probably have to give the tuna, because you can find them year-round there, to the Middle Keys. I'd say the tunas also are a southeast Florida fish, where you're going to see them in big numbers constantly. And then we do get the pretty good pushes because of the deeper wrecks in the lower Keys, because we've got the 300, 350, 400 foot wrecks, and those are attractants. Next, we've got the wahoo. They kind of are very temperature sensitive. They follow the thermoclines, and then they also are impacted by the full moons, especially during the summertime. That's popular for trolling around and finding those edges along the Gulf Stream, temperature drops, and finding them cruising up and down. We also see a big conglomeration, I think might be when they are spawning at the end of the bar at Key West. The free divers will be coming down to shoot them, basically, because they school up at the end of the bar there. I think it might be a spawn, but I'm not sure about that. But I do know that that is the one area that they tend to continually go to. For the wahoo, I'm probably going to have to say the upper Keys, closer to the reef line with the Gulf Stream. And then secondary because of the humps again. Mahi kind of floods into the area. Again, a big pool of them will be the southeast. Summertime, they flood in the entire area from lower Keys all the way up. Again, I'm going to probably have to say the humps and then the adjacency to the Gulf Stream is probably one of the bigger attractants for them. So that'll probably be the primary with the Gulf Stream up north. But like I said, during the middle summertime, they're top to bottom, inside and out. You just got to find them on what depth they're going to be located, and then find that floating structure, and then you'll find them. Kingfish you find a lot on the inside as well as the blue water wrecks. They're attracted to the structure, follow the bait. I'm going to follow the same pattern. I'm going to say that the edge goes to the humps area, actually down here, plus with the reef, and then also the Gulf Stream on the upper Keys. And then marlin, it's not a major fish for the Keys. They do fish after them, they do catch them. I think it's more kind of a bycatch. We've got Woods Wall down here, the canyons where it goes from 1,000 to 2,000 foot drop off, just south of Key West. I think the humps are a little bit too shallow for them, but you still have some deep water there. And they're strictly really a deep water fish, but you do have the Bahamas out this way. I don't know. I have no clue, to be honest with you, on the marlin, so you're going to have to take your guess on that one. Just not really a main fish down here. But anyways, that is the offshore. Where am I going to pick? I am going to say the Middle Keys because of the humps. and then you're just so close to the Gulf Stream, so you can just check out the humps, do some jigging, catch some tunas, catch amberjacks, catch dolphin around there, and then you can head off to the edge of the Gulf Stream going north or south and just follow that edge looking for the other pelagics. And then you've got the reef line as well, which is similar all the way across. So I'm going to have to say the mid keys because of the hump specifically, number one, and then the upper keys because of the proximity of the Gulf Stream and the more impactful zone here where fish tend to kind of coagulate in that southeast Florida. So that's my pick. All right, so we've kind of gone over the lay of the land or lay of the water. We've taken a look at the species breakdown and where the best areas are in that regards. But now we need to take a look at the individual angler, okay, the type of angler. So I've kind of broken that down into a few different categories. One would be the tourist coming down here to fish. Second would be a shore angler. Third would be somebody on a kayak, small craft. 4 would be a flats boat. 5th would be a bay boat, that mid-size. And then finally would be the offshore blue water boat there. And that's kind of important because that's how you're going to get to these fishing locations. So, but it'll be dependent if you have the ability to get to those locations. So starting with the tourist. Tourist is a little bit more dependent on the tourist doing some homework first to establish the zone. First would be is like if there's a specific species that you're looking for would make a big difference. Second would be if there's a specific technique you want to use. For example, if you're a fly fisherman and you want to catch a bonefish, that's going to be a determining factor. Or you want to catch a sailfish, so that's going to be a determining factor. So those that you would kind of need to know ahead of time, and then it would be easier to figure out the location. But with also the caveat, like I always recommend people visiting the Keys, hiring a guide for one, because that will get you to those places and probably give you better success at achieving those goals. But also that they are able to take you out to the backcountry specifically. For the reason the backcountry is very unique is that that is the actual Keys without the US 1 traffic and building and people and all the commotion in that regards. But you get out to that backcountry, there's nobody around you, unspoiled islands, unspoiled waters, and you get to see that nature of the Keys, actual Keys. Versus even going offshore. Yeah, you can even go 100 miles out, but you can also go 10 feet out from the shoreline, look out into the ocean, and you're going to get the same visibility. It's just water and sky. That's all you're going to see. So going out to the backcountry, I think, is a very important aspect if you want to get to know what the actual Keys is about. But depends on what you want to catch. Regards to the shore fishermen, definitely would be probably the middle Keys for the reason of bridges. Now we've got the US 1 bridges where the traffic is on, but a lot of these places have the old US 1 that's been converted over to fishing bridges that are pedestrian only. So that gets you access out onto the water and into the channels. Plus you have all those bridges that have the underbanks where you can kind of walk on the shoreline and fish. Those corners are really good. And third with the middle Keys is that you've got a lot of national parks. You have to pay a few dollars to get in, but they give you a lot of access where you really can't in the rest of the Keys because of private property and mangroves covering the shorelines. But they give you access to the Atlantic side in particular and a lot of beautiful flats and cuts out that direction. And then finally with the middle Keys you have the Big Pine to Sugarloaf in the middle Keys there, that you have those land masses going way out into the Gulf that you can drive through, and you can find fishing spots out in those out of the way areas there and get some really untouched backcountry spots. So definitely the middle Keys there. I did really well in the lower Keys in Key West when I was down there, but the limiting factor there is there's no bridges to get out to the Marquesas or across the channel there to those unspoiled areas that I talk about, so you're limited to just Key West. Next up, kayak. Kayaks will give you the ability to have more options, but the biggest limiting factor is the number 2 quote, which is the wind controls all. And kayaks are very affected by wind. So I'm going to have to say the middle Keys, specifically because of the islands of the Big Pine to the Sugarloaf, Cujo Key area there, and all those islands that go north to south that will protect you from those east to west winds. You have the US 1 that's going to protect those southern corridor winds there, and there's always so many islands that you're able to hide out from the wind and give you more options and more chance to go fish regardless of the weather. Plus you can go along the bridges, any of the bridges as well, so definitely that middle keys gives you a lot of options. Next up would be a flats boat. That gets you, so you get a lot more open water to get to more different areas. That one, the limitation would be just because of the couple of species of the snook, redfish, the speckled trout, because they're more of an Everglades fishery. I would say if those are your priority, then it would definitely be the upper keys and going across through the Everglades Flamingo area. If those weren't a priority, then I would say the Key West lower keys, because that gives you a chance to go to the west across the channel to those islands and the flats out there, and then even to the Marquesas if you're willing to make that run. Untouched, unspoiled, unpressured areas there, so much better fishery. You just have a lot more limitations on those prior species there. Next would be a bay boat. Again, gets you a little bit more flexibility and more wind. I would still say middle keys, because wind still is a bay boat is still dependent on the wind, and the island coverage in that middle keys will get you more days on the water. More ability to fish means better time down in the keys. When the wind, also you actually have those middle keys bridges, deeper water, bigger channels there that you can fish. And then if the weather cooperates, you can head out to the reef and be okay there. So the middle keys has a lot of options, especially with a little bit of limitations of the wind, and even the patch reefs if you just go a little bit south there. Finally, we've got the offshore boats. That's the big boats, so not so much backcountry. You could fish the main channels, but you got that big boat so you can handle the bigger winds, so you're not as limited. You're really not going to be running across the flats in the north side, so I wouldn't count that. So you're really looking at chasing the play jigs, the reef, and the offshore blue water. And in that regard, I would split it, kind of know it to the middle keys because specifically of the humps. That is such a fish magnet, okay, that would be a huge priority, and that would be a huge motivational thing, is anywhere around that humps. Plus you've got that Gulf Stream that runs across the whole thing, but you have the Gulf Stream by the humps. However, if you're wanting more than just the pelagic side of it, then I would probably have to say a better mix would be to go to the lower keys. That gets you out to past the Marquesas, out towards the Tortugas, and then you're that Wild West, unspoiled, untouched. Those are dumber and bigger fish out that direction there, and you still have the Gulf Stream. You still have the ability to go some deep wrecks to do the vertical jigging, and you still got all those pelagics cruising up and down that edge there. So that would probably be outside of, unless you're really going to be dedicated to the humps, then I would say the lower keys and Key West there. So that's that. And so let's wrap this up, and I'll give you my recommendation. If I only had one place to choose, where would it be? Bam! Finally, I think we're coming to the end. Ready to stick a fork in this video. But it's a kind of a complex question. There's so many variables. I think I kind of covered the main portion of it, so we're good there. Now it finally comes down to that main question of, if I, Steve, had the choice to live in one spot in the Keys, where would it be? Okay, so I'm going to go off kind of that I don't really have any limitations. I'm not stuck because of the All About the Bait company or anything in regards to that. I could just pick where I want to live, what island I want to live, and that's where I'd be. That island would be any of the 4 or 5 between Big Pine and Sugarloaf. Okay, they're all similar, just long islands there, so it wouldn't matter which one, but any one of those. And the reason being is my number 2 saying, the wind controls all. those islands that run north to south create so much of a windbreak. It just gives you the opportunity to fish in really windy conditions, and that means more time on the water, which means more happy fishing. So that's kind of a really big aspect. Also, you've got the bigger channels with the bigger bridges right there in that same area. Got those big tarpon migration meeting there. So you have a lot of options just in that area there. Beautiful flats. I said it's probably the most options in regards to structure in that area. So you got all the flats, backcountry, inshore fisheries there. You've got the wide assortment. Even the fish from the Everglades are sitting up shop there. But then I've still got those the Grand Slam species intermixed as well. But also the main reason too is I'm right in the middle of that golden triangle. Okay, the triangle is the Everglades to the north, the humps to the south, and then you've got the Wild West out to the west. And that zone there is exactly in the middle of them, where I could get a flats boat and I can make the 35 mile run to the Everglades and get that bread basket of fish going there if I want to make the runs and I don't want to fish right where I'm at. Or I can get the offshore boat and then run out to the humps and get in all the pelagics out that direction and get the best of that. Or again, I can go out west to the Wild West, which is the best of that, the bigger, dumber fish out that way, or even the a lot less stressed out flats fishing around that Marquesas and in between Marquesas and the Key West there. So all that's within shooting distance of that middle key section there. So that would definitely be the area. So anyways, that is it. Thanks for watching. Congratulations on sitting through this, my longest video ever, but I kind of wanted to get it out of the way, so there you go. But anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you next video. Bye.